area between the National Ballpark and Navy Yard. And Tricia, sorry, the southeast. What did I say? Southwest. Southeast. And Tricia is going to take us there and show her thesis project. Okay, Tricia?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
Nope.
No? It says it's on.
Oh, it's okay.
Hello?
There you go.
Okay, sorry. Welcome, good morning. My name is Tricia Rowedder, and I'm going to be talking to you about testing the limits in DC, an EcoBlock that can create a community for everyone. First, I would like to start by thanking Professor Dupuis, Julie Gabrielli, my chair, Professor Tillman, well, all the professors who have helped me through this, as well as family and friends that have gotten me to this point. So, DC is different from any other urban in the US. Some of the most significance for this reason might be the restricted building height that allows us to, instead of build up, build out. The restriction of the sprawl in DC with limited development spaces, the plentiful public space and attractions along the mall. And while one would think with all these factors, DC would feel like a small and intimate and tight-knit city that thrives on these personal relationships and interactions with one another. Many of the citizens might not feel this way. DC is ranked as the second loneliest city in the US. So why is that? When looking at our architecture, oftentimes you see buildings that are pancaked together with only circulation in elevators or in a main stair corridor. So what if we purposefully implement different scales of interaction all throughout the building, combating this idea of loneliness and bringing you forced and happenstance interactions amongst other people. And so I'm proposing we do this through an EcoBlock. Well, what is an EcoBlock? Of course, we know the biggest source of emissions and energy consumption in the world is buildings. And architecture and landscape have always and will always inform the communities and the people around them. Not only those who inhabit the buildings, but those who might pass by and engage in it in other ways. Whether these are designed well or they're designed poorly, the final product has an effect on not only our minds, but subsequently on our actions. So this schism between the built environment and the natural environment has caused this disconnectivity with us and the importance of nature. The urban block and its surrounding connections are essential functioning elements of the city. So this is a great place to start when trying to reevaluate this. Ecosystems are a community of the living and non-living things, and that can be anywhere from under a tree or a pond to a massive park system. So when most people think of ecosystems, they tend to relate solely to nature, but there's human ecosystems as well, and we interact mostly in the built environment. So an EcoBlock is a term I created for this intersection of these two ecosystems, the human ecosystem as well as the natural ecosystem inside the urban fabric. This thesis explores the development of dynamic interior and exterior spaces throughout not only a building, but an EcoBlock system, so that forced and happenstance connections and interaction of people are created as a means to revitalize community in DC. This new EcoBlock requires both interchangeable as well as permanent pieces. And so I've created, to start at this massive scale proposal, how do you start? You start with 6 principles. A large area, major connection, car circulation only on the exterior of the block, porous public connection throughout the block, dynamic program, not only through horizontal applications but vertical as well, equal access to amenities for every program as well as in exterior space, and then of course light and air. So from these principles, I derived an even further set of rules to help actually design this thing. First of which is circulation. I split up the site into 4 cores, and each core has access to circulation that occurs beneath the site. And then each of those cores have a drop-off zone, a service zone, as well as a HVAC system room. And so this service circulation happens only on the exterior, but I've allowed for emergency vehicles to travel through the center, only emergency vehicles. The rest of the vehicles will solely travel on the exterior of the block, whether that's service or a typical car circulation. And then I've designed drop-off zones, which are these green ones, as well as parallel parking along the street front. And so dynamic program mix, it might be easier to see in the model, but I've mixed the program all throughout the block, and I've put it into 4 categories. Yellow, residential; red is retail, commercial; green is an innovative office that I'm proposing, and then orange is food. Might be hard to differentiate orange and the yellow a little bit. So I'll keep getting into that as we progress. For light and air, the courtyards I gave specific ideas and dimensions to as well. If you go up 2 stories, you set back a certain amount, 25 feet. If you go up 3, 30 feet. And you can see that on the interior corridor, I've done the same as well. Yeah. Where this dimension, though, is a bit smaller because this runs through the whole site. A courtyard might have more flexibility in how they shape their spaces. So density. To tackle massing of a large scale, I had to think about how do we start with this. Looking at different sizes that would be good for certain types of program. So 50 by 50, 75 by 50, and never getting larger than 125 by 75. This allows for a good mix of program, whether it be residential, office, commercial. You're able to manipulate these. And then the smallest dimension, 75 by 25, if it got any smaller than that, I considered it an unusable space, and so there wouldn't be massing there. So, jumping into the site. So where are we in DC? We're in the Washington Navy Yard, and I chose this site largely because it has a lot of great connections to the city, and it's a very developing area as well. But also more locally, it has the metro, it has the Washington Ballpark, great access to the water. This is my site. And then it's flanked by the Anacostia as well as M Street, an active corridor. And so this land borders my site here, borders the Navy Yard right here. And this Navy Yard has a fence that runs along the entire west side of it. And so no construction, I guess there would be no access from the west side of that into the site. It's this hard security border. And so I started to juggle with that a little bit when thinking about how I could start to develop this site. There's a variety of parks and schools as well, and so when starting to think about the program and this innovation center that will start to bring people not only for jobs and activities, but also start to engage the waterfront and perhaps bring the kids from the local schools and the offices as well. And then I proposed new roads. So as you can see, the road here didn't align with the street above, and as well as this one didn't connect through either. So I connected both streets and then provided an access through the center of the block as well. block extents. My site was 400 by 1,000 feet. So how did I start to mass it? I broke it down into a major axis, one going north-south, connecting M Street to the waterfront, and east-west to the new streets. I stepped down towards the waterfront to allow for the light and air to be able to get into these spaces that I'm going to start to carve these courtyards out of. And then at the end, I stepped back up to allow for that opportunity of development along the waterfront. Then I located different nodes of interaction that I was going to carve out, whether locating based on current site conditions and programs surrounding how big and where these were going to be. Next, I carved out each of these blocks, varying in sizes and opportunities of program and connection all around them. And lastly, you have the EcoBlock. So, in my EcoBlock, if looking around to the current community around it, this is food, this is the local community, this is how much I have on my site. Green is office and institution within the quarter mile, and the lighter one is my site. And then again, it goes residential and then retail. So you can see I tried to have a mixture of program that correlated somewhat with the population in the area and the rich development that's starting to occur. These are some of the courtyards, the landscape that I chose to connect these quadrants that I designed. Sorry, it's hard to see. And so the ground floor plane, I did a mixture of retail, office, and residential here, as you can see, but, and we went through this a bit as well. But I designed it so that it could be divided up into parcels. This is how I divided it up, but let's say you wanted to divide one piece or this piece, you could completely sell it off. And so I started to look at how could this actually develop? Who would want to buy a piece of this? How could you break it down and still create these rules and set of guidelines for someone to come in and design and develop a piece of this, but still fit into the whole? And so each of these pieces correlates to that, how I did my massing for it. But theoretically, they could be developed a little different if following these guidelines. So a loft infrastructure. I chose to use a loft as the type of construction for my site. It utilizes a flexible and open framework that easily adapts to changing cycles of use and maintenance and creates a community that can continue to flourish and adapt over time. So building in this modular way, I'm able to create a more resilient site that can last in the long term, as well as accommodate all the different changing lifestyles that occur in an urban city. So creating this new EcoBlock neighborhood addresses this need for the real social networks and a sense of belonging in a highly individualized society that we're in today. So diving a bit further into detail, I masked the whole site and developed the ground floor, but then I jumped into just one parcel of it, one building, the Innovation Center, and this would act as the hub of the green program I've designed that's kind of connecting the whole site and the entire block. And so reading this plan, as you can see, as you go up, the blue is going to be open to below, and the orange is the privatized spaces. So on the exterior, the party walls, I aligned my cores, and then I developed a mixture as you go up through the floors of different types of interaction, whether that be closed office spaces, open office spaces, meeting rooms, collaboration centers, classrooms, labs. And then I also included terraces. I started punching into the facade because of this easy floor plate of the loft design. I was able to manipulate it very easily. So if you're looking at the section, you can see some of these different types of interaction all throughout. Yes.
a little lost, so I don't want you to go too far, because where is that in relation to that? And it's the turn?
Okay, so it's right here.
Okay, so is this same orientation, north is to the
Is up.
left?
Yes, yes, to the left.
North is to the left on these plans.
Yes. This is the entrance right here.
You point that plan, ground floor plan out in your ground floor plan there.
Right here.
I'm a little lost. Where is that guy? Oh, we didn't include,
The wing's not
the
there.
wing is not here.
It's wing.
Oh yes, it's wingless. So this is a piece of retail. So I designed the square building in here that fit within the modular system that I had created.
For your portfolio, you need to include everything in every one of these plans, what's happening adjacent to it, because this is really disembodied.
Okay.
But anyway, just, it's a kind of, I just was really
Absolutely.
lost.
Sorry about that. North is to the left. So the waterfront is on the south and M Street is on the north.
What's that mean? What's the wing of it?
Yeah, right here. So going on to these nodes of interaction and connection that I started with, looking at just a couple of these and their relations to the site around them, whether it's on the exterior or on the interior, looking at these meeting spaces and how they join the collaboration, the circulation zones, the dynamic lobby spaces, the plazas that connect these retail along with all these offices, and as well as these terraces and how they relate to the adjacent areas. And I'd like to conclude. So building in blocks can have a sense of inclusion and diversity and community by creating these spectrum of spaces that are a variety of scale and allow for engagement not only with one another but as well with nature. So not only does this present a possible solution, or at the very least an aid to this epidemic of loneliness in DC, but it can infuse the city with a sense of belonging and personal connections to one another, as well as their surroundings. I'd like to open the floor for any comments or questions or concerns.
Is this on? Well, thank you. It's an ambitious project. I've had a student do the same site, and it was very difficult, very big, very deep, and needed housing here. So it was extremely difficult site. And I want to thank you for, it's an ambitious project. It's ambitious and forward-thinking. In a sense, this is, you're designing for the 22nd century of DC almost. Density is increased. It sort of reminds me of Osaka or Tokyo in terms of its urbanism. In Tokyo, did you look at the Japanese Asian cities?
Yeah, I looked at a couple of them. I looked at China Superblocks as well, starting in this. I also looked at metabolism and archigram and kind of all those different precedents when starting the process.
What did you learn from those? Why did those exist? Did you find those exist, or essentially they work in Tokyo and in Japan because of, why do you think they work there, and how do they need to transform, or what needs to happen in DC for that to work here?
Sure. I don't necessarily know Tokyo, Japan quite well. I know the movements larger and certain specific superblocks that I studied more in depth. But a lot of them tended to fail because while they were implementing these big principles, they had the right rules that they set up, but then the follow-through fell through. And they created often very individualized pieces, and so this didn't really allow for interaction amongst people. I would imagine that in Tokyo, Japan, the population is also very high and that this might work as well. Especially in DC, I think it could work because of the increased population and the drive back to the city.
Well, one of the reasons it does work in Japan is the density. You go up 3 or 4 flights to get to a restaurant, and there's retail on the 10th floor because you have to. There's not enough street edge.
Right.
The ground floor retail and residential or office above is not the tradition. It's just you can't have it there. It's just too dense. So I think your project can work, but I'm not sure. I think you have to sort of anticipate what will happen around DC for this to work. That's my only kind of, it's like you're probably too forward thinking in a way. You're where cities might be in the next 100 years as opposed to today, but that's a good thing, I guess. My only other kind of question is going back to your initial principles. I admire that you came up with principles. It's like, okay, this is the issues I wanted. I'm just a little uncomfortable with some of them. And for example, the superblock. You made a big block and then you divided it in 2. You demapped a street, and you've done some fundamental things that are counterintuitive to the way we actually design cities. Can you talk about why you made, which is somewhat counterintuitive move?
Sure. So I knew that I wanted a lot of pedestrian activity in this, which is why kind of mentally I was a little deterred from allowing a car into the center. But largely the reason that I demapped the streets and reconnected it was to fit back into the grid. So the streets were shifted off originally, and the buildings that are on this site, half of the site they're literally crumbling to the ground right now. Half the buildings aren't used, and most the buildings that are being used are office or just infrastructure for that office. It basically is storage. But so the entire north half of the site was completely needed to be rebuilt. And so by shifting this street that was originally here down, I allowed for this pedestrian corridor down the center and a good sizable block of activity in between.
Well, since I have a microphone.
You should give some dimensions of these blocks so that they're clear.
Okay.
And were those lockbox streets that you shifted or not? Do you know?
I don't know off the
The
top
stuff
of
down
my
there maybe
head.
was a bit ad hoc. It grew in a very ad hoc sort of way. It may not be lockbox.
I would assume that it isn't because the grid north of my site that I aligned with goes up several streets, and mine was the only one that was off, so I would assume.
Did you want to give dimensions?
Dimensions, yeah. So my building's 175. The corridor is 50 building to building. No, sorry. 175. I'm doing the math in my head. Of a 400-foot block is 50. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Flustered. The dimensions of the square is 200 by 200.
Do you know how that compares to something like City Center?
Yes, so City Center would be actually rather quite small. It would take up about a quarter of my site, maybe somewhere around here. So it's really not that large, but then when you compare it to things such as the wharf, it starts to make sense in this scale as well.
Okay, well, I am very intrigued by the variety of spaces that you've created inside the block. I think it's very interesting and wonderful, and I can picture people interacting with each other, passing through these spaces. I worry a little bit about the interaction with the rest of the city. How inviting is this to actually people who aren't privileged to live there or work there? Where will there be controlled access to all of these spaces, much like our city center? City Center has this public space on New York Avenue, and they've got the security guards there to prevent anybody from being there after hours and things like that. So, could you address that? I mean, like the facade facing the rest of the city. Is that one of the facades, or is that?
Yeah, so for my building, I just did a very simple grid structure of the facade that aligned with the columns, and it was more, I had to deal with my taste, I think, really, than speaking to the site particularly. Or the idea with the loft building is that you have a lot of flexibility in how you can design the building, what you can cut out and what you can put up as a facade. And so the design of it becomes very, I guess, open-ended to those who want to design it. As for accessibility to the site, I was also very concerned with that as well, which is why I tried to make very strategic points of access. This is a parking lot that will always remain a parking lot because it connects to the Anacostia waterfront trail, which starts just further down my site, and then it ends at a closed boardwalk before coming to the rest of the Navy Yard. And that's a controlled point. So my site really now becomes the end of this trail until you pick back up a while up the river. So I tried to choose very strategic points of access as well as give a lot of room between the buildings so that it appears as if there's a lot of space and it's very open and anyone can come in. Because I think in DC we're often used to walking into big plazas and it feeling inviting.
So is the idea that developers would come in and develop a certain parcel of it, but the massing would have to match the preconceived massing that you have?
The massing could shift slightly, but the idea is that by following these principles, your building would turn out a pleasant building with experiences. I mean, that would be the hope of it. But the massing could shift slightly. I proposed a massing that followed these rules, and I guess they could. And a facade design.
Can you talk about?
I was just I think you started to get to the comments you were just making. I understand your principles, and I was resting my head trying to understand if you perceive this to be a completely developer-driven project, or if the intent of your thesis was to set out an approach to development, if you will, meaning, like, your principles are great at a higher level, but it's hard for me to make the jump from your principles to the actual forms,
Right.
and lacking a little bit more detail. I wonder what your thoughts are on why someone wouldn't just max out FAR and make the code work. Like, how do you actually implement this? And I say that in part because I think, in order to make this actually thrive, I think you perhaps have it. You need a slight bit more granularity as to how you actually begin to define the rules.
Yeah.
Did you think about that anymore?
I definitely did. I kind of dug too deep into details, I think, and at that point it got almost impossible to design the site as a whole, and so I had to step back. But I think setting up those 3 modules that you can use to build, and then requiring that you have access to the block as well as the courtyards have to step back every so often, similar to how you would think of buildings in New York, with the setbacks. I think I was proposing a way in which to help control the development without fully developing and designing every nook and cranny of it. So I was trying to make a feasible proposal that someone would see and then could come in and design part of it into further detail. I guess I don't know if that was getting at your question.
So,
One of the discussions we had, just to clarify a little bit, I was a late-breaking member of the committee. One of the discussions we had was this question of dimension and ventilation, and sometime in the future, buildings get a little narrower because we want to naturally ventilate them and things. And I think, Tricia, I would argue with one thing you said, which was, I think what we talked about is this is one way that this could be realized.
Right.
You lay down the basic cruciform with the square, and if you follow the rules, which aren't maybe completely articulated, but there are lots of different ways that this sort of complexity of inside the block could take shape as long as you sort of made the outside do the things you wanted to do. I think that's one of the things we were talking about. Right?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So it's a question I have, you talked before initially about creating community and that cars should remain outside. And I think there's a missed opportunity in looking at some precedent studies for ways you can integrate cars and pedestrians. And I think specifically of Copenhagen. Copenhagen has a wonderful system where pedestrians and cars overlap safely. And what strikes me about it is that you have this super block and you've cut a slice right through the middle of it and you've kind of done nothing with that big space in the middle. And it seems like a really big missed opportunity. Also, I question the actual functions of your exterior spaces. While they have a variety of space size, which I think is really good, there's just a lot of cross paths and I'm curious how you anticipate people being active in them, aside from walking and sitting. Because communities need green space. Yes, you've got green space along the water, but you have the potential here to have amazing interior spaces that are far more functional. It looks like in the Plaza 2 image, there's maybe a kid running, maybe about to hit a soccer ball, I don't know, but that's not enough space for them. Right. And so you have the opportunity here in this variety of spaces to make some dedicated zones for activity, which I think communities need. I also feel like the scope is immense and ambitious, as many people have said, and so you've tackled a ton. But I would zoom out one more time and just question how this block relates to anything around it. Because the first thing you described is it's butted up against the Navy Yard, which is a security wall and a wall. And so maybe there are diagrams in the process that talk about how you can interact with that, break that, treat that side differently. But right now it seems you're treating all four edges the same, even though you've got water to one way, and I don't know what's happening on the other side. So maybe if you can explain a little bit about that. I feel like if you're going to do something that is about community, it shouldn't be insular to this block. It needs to be able to be something that can grow and thread together with its surrounding blocks.
Yeah, absolutely. So to the east of the site, if north is over here, right up here, I put a street, and then I also developed on the east side of it, putting something small scale, whether that be residential or something, to create that buffer between my EcoBlock and the Navy Yard, and allow for the street to act as a uniter between these two sides rather than something that's dividing the fabric. And to the west side, these buildings are slowly, if you saw in plan, stepping back as they reach my site. And so I was hoping that my center would start to be this core, this point of activity that then would spiral out into the rest of the site. So this would kind of act as that catchment. I do agree with you that I missed some opportunities in developing that further. I think I got a little bit lost in a lot of other things.
There's a huge scale thing where I feel like you don't even need to show a plan. Like, you don't need to go into the intricacies of what's in it. Right? Who cares if there's a table and chairs or not? Right. I feel like it would do you well to step that back and just diagrammatically show, not dissimilar to how you're doing your initial work, but diagrammatically show how the space is used, how it functions, and how people will interact. It's for people, so you might do a series of those diagrams.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I have a quick question on that. The non-innovation center floor plans on your ground floor plan, are they what program are they?
So I created, again, this list so that it was easy to define when looking at the big site. And so when you're seeing these, you're seeing places of retail, and this is residential, a hotel actually that's built above it, a bowling alley, and then offices. So I tried to keep kind of these collections that became this way to quickly understand what's going on in the site without very intricately designing each of those spaces.
Okay. I have recently completed a 3.5-acre mixed-use project about 10 blocks north of this at the Eastern Market. So I'm really interested in how you went about dividing the site and fitting a program in. I have a couple pretty technical comments, which is the best thing you could do to attract the best developers would be to put in one big underground garage under the entire site, not stopping at that section. And put in one big truck dock for all trucks to come down below grade and serve all the different multi-uses.
Right.
That really, you're spending a certain amount of resources very efficiently, which is, I think, in keeping with what you're trying to do. But then you've got the parking grid coming up through the buildings, which isn't unfortunately 28 by 28. But anyway, so that's very technical, and I'm saying that this project doesn't exist at that level. But I do know that your center space is not going to attract people the way it has these different uses around it. Ultimately, in the project I did, we put the public space adjacent to one of the streets so that there's a natural flow.
So something coming from M Street or
Perhaps, yeah. The space that you created at the end of the park trail, I'm wondering why that isn't more of the park than that continues up. So I've been frustrated by hitting the gate, the closed gate at the end of that path. And that would actually possibly bring a lot of people up and then over to Barracks Row Main Street for all the restaurants.
Yeah.
And complete that flow. And when there's a residential building in a very dense neighborhood, the courtyard spaces tend to be reserved for the residents, which means they can't really be open to the general public coming in. And so, I don't quite see that in terms of all the free-flowing space and the public meandering. And there's certain public safety problems with surveilling and making these places feel safe. It's a very ambitious project. I think it's really interesting. It would have been interesting to even push the density higher and add another 4 stories to the building.
It's interesting to me that you seem to avoid the facades, which maybe instead of doing all of that work at the ground floor, as someone said earlier, that you then took one part of the facade and developed it as much as you did for the floor plans here. Because it's part of your education here. I mean, right now, some of these facades are windows, these are not big. It's not museum space, right? And so you missed that opportunity for your education, I think, to develop that. It doesn't mean you can't do it this summer.
Absolutely.
Be it for your portfolio. Well, to be competitive, you're going to go out, you're looking for a job, why not? I think, again, that you maybe could have been steered to look at city center, to see what works and what doesn't work. The scale you have of that public space sort of reminds me of a little bit of the inversion of the Gothic Quarter in Barcelona, the way they intersect and have those spaces that are needed. So then the volume of the building really starts to shape the space. I think, at first I thought, well, maybe that's too big, but you could have made a park out of that. I mean, as big as this is, and really landscape it. They have trees, they have this little park in the middle of all of this density. Then the other thing I was wondering, the loneliness factor, what is that?
Yeah.
Because when I drive around the city, it looks pretty, people are interacting, and Friday nights, there are people lined up on Connecticut Avenue getting to these bars and clubs, so I don't...
I think it's a really interesting topic because I think on the surface level, it always looks like that in almost every city. But when
it looks like there's
activity. And I think that particularly in DC, personally and socially, I've experienced that a lot of people don't feel that way in the city. They feel like they have to go somewhere, and whether it's the mall is free, but most other places you pay for, and it's expensive to live in the city, and it's expensive and difficult to get to these places. And so oftentimes I think people are starting to do these things only for show, and then this facade starts to be put up. And I think it also kind of relates just socially back to our culture in this individualized society. And so I just wanted to kind of dig deeper into that and see, well, where does everything start with this? Like, when you're looking at depression that's spiking, it's becoming a health crisis in our nation. Like, how do things like that start to happen? Where are some of the first steps? So I was just interested in loneliness. That's kind of how that sparked getting the ball rolling for me.
That's because you're in Thesis.
Again, I think if there is an issue for DC, it's the gentrification, and it's all of these people coming together. And so, when we design mixed-use projects that have residential, there are community rooms, there's a business center, there are things within the actual housing, at least in the new housing, that we put in to have people to feel comfortable to go beyond their apartment unit itself.
Right.
So I was just wondering where you felt that, and then you did the research to see that DC is the most lonely city.
Yeah. So I think that is starting. Second.
What was first?
Las Vegas.
That I understand.
But yeah, so I was looking into that, and I found that a lot of new buildings, a lot of new development in DC is starting to do all of that. But the majority of DC is very historic, and so it's not very common for that to be. I'm from Rockville. Yeah.
You really have to delve into what community means and how to create community. Community garden, there's no, what are the interactions that happen to make community? You're showing people passing each other, but community is building relationships and trust and sharing experiences. So I think you have to go back to what are the activities that people are going to be doing to have those experiences, and then have your architecture and your program form around those.
Okay. Yeah. Absolutely.
In the eye center that could have tied in more of the green and the water to entice people in, and maybe you found this in your thought process and could explain it, but the eye center, I was starting to wonder who the client is, who the tenant is. Is this more of a community, library, community center, facility for everybody in that parcel or that block? Are there breakout spaces for social interactions, cafes, or bumping into line, talking to somebody in line for their coffee? Maybe you can speak about that as you're thinking about, okay, we've got outside green spaces. Maybe I just talk really softly. The green spaces are really quite lovely for walking paths, but like we're saying, programs, social activities, but bringing into the building. And then can you speak more about the activities within the eye center?
Yeah, absolutely. So the overall idea of when you're thinking about Google or Amazon or all of these headquarters, they're starting to have these types of flexible spaces. And so I was interested in how can we start to use that, but also think about how this digital and natural world can convene. And so can some of these spaces foster like a convention? Could we have an auditorium that could link back to people who are staying in the hotel that are coming into town for this? Could it relate back to classrooms for all the schools that are in the surrounding area can start to use these spaces to start to learn about technology, or we can start to dive into the waterfront and all the ecology of the waterfront. And so I was playing with this flexible idea of how we can bridge two, I think, very different approaches, the digital and the natural innovation, and how I could make spaces that would accommodate both of those. And so I was implementing a variety of closed versus open office, a cafeteria in the building, as well as classrooms in the building or laboratories in the building and large communal spaces. So there's this issue of what's private and what's public, and so I started to define some more privatized spaces while leaving some more open. And I didn't necessarily label specifically each one, but I was trying to get at that that you were mentioning.
Tricia, again, first of all, for your parents, she's graduated, so don't worry about this. She's going to have a degree in a week or so. With that said, I'm a little confused about how to critique this project. In some ways, the project is for 50 to 100 years in the future, but the other times you're talking about it as a developer today. So for example, the Navy Yard, you're assuming that that's going to be stationary, and you're assuming that the way urbanism is done in Washington is going to stay stationary or stay static, when in fact, I just know that Navy Yard is going to go away one day. It's going to change. It's going to be like the Philadelphia Navy Yard, or it's going to be base consolidation. I mean, I think there's some issues of, is this about the future or is this about today? Is it, when is this going to be done? When did you imagine this is going to be done?
Set a year on it.
Okay.
I think that I was trying to merge the two. I was trying to be very forward thinking, but I was trying to start to apply some practicality of what actually is just starting to be developed today. Mm-hmm. And so I was struggling between the two, I think, when designing this.
I would encourage you, first of all, to be more aggressive with it. I think that pulling this through along into the Navy Yard, pulling the waterfront, this is not going to stay there. I just can't imagine it's going to stay, based on the pressures on the government and the Navy and the military and the city, etc. So I'd encourage you to push this a little farther, if you will. And I think that you've kind of, I can see this kind of debate happening where you're getting, it's sort of normative, you know, the kind of office space of 1999 or 2010 versus the kind of vision of, with your section, which is probably the best drawing on your drawing in your project. These little sections are, for me, the ones that are most about what this could be. But that's one of the smallest drawings. I think I would go look at that drawing. You did that drawing, right? That's your drawing.
Yeah, I manipulated it off of something I had seen.
Okay, well, I think there's a character to that drawing that is missing in other parts of your project. It just seems to me there's something about the vision of the future there that I would encourage you to experiment with, because you can't just say, I'm going to put programming here and people are going to interact, and use the word forcing. And I know you tried to almost use quotes when you said it, but you're using a lot of this sort of like, if I do this, the people will be not lonely. My last comment is the issue of looking at other cities that are trying to do this. I mean, what is non-lonely urbanism? What cities are considered not lonely, and what do they look like? And does that have anything to do with the architecture or urbanism, or is it independent of it?
I don't know a specific city off the top of my head, but I think that someone mentioned the Gothic Quarter in Barcelona, and I know that area very well. I studied there for several months. And so I was looking at some of how those spaces, how the buildings were defining those spaces, and it forced people to go to a specific spot, or it allowed more open areas where you got to choose. And so I was trying to understand, how could I start to make some of this where I'm forcing them to end up in a specific location, whereas in other spots it's more flexible and really up to them. And so when I had those slides of loneliness up at the beginning, I did a bunch of research on it, and how do you incorporate people back into society, essentially. And you start small scale, and then you work up to larger scale. And so I was trying to balance these different interactions of those scales and different intentional moments in the design.
What do you mean by force, Tricia? I find that word so jarring,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I don't think that you intend that jarringness, right?
Right.
So what do you mean by that?
I think what I mean by that is a specific intention or a very directional design in which it's very clear to the user and the function of the space and what you do in the space.
Is it, I guess, if someone feels forced, they could turn around, right? So is this a spatial idea, or is it about desire, in a certain way, that, you know, I don't have many options in terms of, I can go forward or I can go backwards, right?
Right.
Or in the space where you say it's more open, where there's more choices. So I would much rather feel an environment where I'm moving forward because the architects created a desire, right? There's something that's enticing me to go there, as opposed to feeling like I'm in a cage and I don't. So I somehow, maybe you could speak a little more about that, because I know you don't mean a cage.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think when I'm talking about force, I'm really talking about, like you were saying, the destination, the end goal, where you want to end up. And so I'm trying to figure ways of directing that movement, the flow, the circulation.
That's a better word.
Directing the movement. And so I guess forced is a bad way to say it, but I was trying to give intentional reason to move in a certain direction that would make you want to move in that direction by putting something there, an opportunity, guidance.
Very interesting project. I really enjoyed it. I like the way you've created this kind of EcoBlock idea. That said, right now it feels like you've created this new ecological region that has been plopped down in the middle of yet another region, right? Mm-hmm. And so you need to think about the term ecotone. And the ecotone is where two ecological zones come together, right? And I think that's where you haven't completely gotten the sort of outside access in quite right yet, because it's this idea of movement and change in that ecotone. So think about that concept as you're maybe rethinking some of these spatial moves in terms of open area and access, right? As somebody from Detroit, right now it feels a little like the Renson, which is the loneliest place on earth. If you haven't been there, you should go there once. But anyways, let me pass this on.
They tried to fix it and fix it and fix it.
I suspect that many of the answers to your thesis questions can be found due north of the expressway in Capitol Hill, which is the least lonely community I've ever known. Mm-hmm. And it's basically worked on the grid of the city. But the streets, which have parallel parking in front of houses and the public space between the sidewalk and the front of the house is developed, they're typically an upper unit and a lower English basement unit. Mm-hmm. And everyone who comes and goes from their house all day long, they transverse by the streets, through the yards, to the streets, to the metro, to wherever. Mm-hmm. And so there are these natural paths of pedestrians all day long going through the Capitol Hill community. And that's where you walk your dog and you meet your neighbor who's also walking their dog. You sit on the stoop on a nice day and you say hi to people on the porch. Mm-hmm. Those are the things that naturally allow people to interact. And I think that idea of naturally allowing people to interact is really key here. And I think that maybe you do want cars coming in that north-south center because of the activity that it brings. And you've got people, parking their cars, and other people walking their dogs, and it all leads down to the water. Mm-hmm. And then maybe the central space is activated because you've got got some cars going through it, on low speed. But,
Uber.
You can have cars, and cars can be guests.
yes.
So, it's a penultimate remark. I very much appreciate, Tricia, you taking this on, because I think this was something, for you, learning about urbanism was a bit of a new thing, as a perception I got, right? And so, I greatly admire the effort here, because I think, first of all, it's a difficult part of the city. You're trying something new. I think the comments about looking into the future, and maybe a future maybe where there aren't automobiles, or we have to build buildings that are narrower so we can make more ventilation and natural ventilation and stuff like that, is probably where this might go if we made you stay here a few more months and work on this. I do admire, though, the diagrams and the explanation. It's a really nice synthesis of the problem. And I think one of the things that Thesis does for people is it provides them a springboard to look at things into the future. And what I really like about the project is, in spite of all the flaws and things that people pointed out, there's no such thing as a perfect project, I get the sense that this is a sort of whole realm of investigation and understanding that is opening up to you, and I would just encourage you to continue.
Absolutely.
Was that the end? Was that the
That's why I said penultimate.
Okay, then Brian.
I think that, you know, going back to your initial diagram here, I would have loved to have seen you really take on identity and go to one person and say, okay, how would this person identify with these different spaces? Because people really want a sense of ownership in their space, especially when they're living there, whether it's a flag or a wreath or something. I mean, so I think, what would the approach be if you had sort of taken a person's day and walked through? I think you'd find that you might design a little bit more in section, which you seem to be doing really well, and I think, you know, really helps with this site. So you might just take a step back and look at it again from there. The other thing I would say is, I thought when we first started the diagrams here that we were going to go into something where you're saying, I'm producing X amount of food on this site, and you know, I'm bringing the Potomac into this bizarre slot between the Navy Yard and here, and I'm going to really change the water and be completely sustainable on the site, and you've given us all these roofs here. None of them are green. So I think that that's one aspect that I would just take a look at an overview and say, how can I then also make this a very sustainable living place as well?
Absolutely.
Patricia, this is a really great effort here. Congratulations. One of the things, as Amy Weinstein was talking, that made me think about this was that as designers we make choices in the process. And there's a choice, a lot of choices you made about the character of street, the character of courtyard, the character of plaza. And as a result of that, the sort of ecosystem that weaves between the built world of your building seems to me to be very fragmentary. And I wonder if one were to be a little bit more frugal about the building, to make the building be more compact in its footprint, and to go back to what Amy suggested about loading the streets with more energy, that maybe some of those courtyard spaces might compress a bit, the streets might become more generous, and we might think about the relationship between the riparian environment along the Anacostia and these fingers that go back as filters, really, for the kind of environment, the streets, the runoff and stuff like that. Right now, the landscape that's being shown, not only this comment about the green roofs being absent, but also the ground plane, just seems fragmentary, and there's a trade-off of all these little private courtyards, which I think are places to be lonely, versus the description of the street, action of the street, that by minimizing those a bit, you would actually give yourself a little bit more room to create a kind of a much more coherent green environment pulling things together. The telltale point for me is at the very southern end of your site, where I would expect a vigorous connection in terms of the riparian environment, the river's edge, and then the green fingers going back. It just it's non-existent there. And I think that's the place where you'd really want to make it clear that this environment kind of goes back. Congratulations, Ed. Great job. Keep going.
You did it. This thesis has been just so interesting to be involved with. It's an exploration of how big ideas and theory can inform design intentions and then spatial development. And I think the level of discussion that we've had today really bears that out. And I think that you have paid a lot of attention to the experiences of the users. And now that you've got your arms around it, you can take that further. But one thing I really admired about your process is that you really tackled this challenge of how do you take something that's pretty abstract, like loneliness, as a concept, as a sort of sociological idea, and really try to ground it in concrete reality and looking at land use and population of the context and connections and floor plate dimensions for different building types and development parcels and area calculations and service, emergency access. I mean, you really, light and air, you really looked at this thing 6 ways from Sunday. And I think that perhaps, it's such a big project, that, the comments are really kind of showing you sort of where it could go next, not so much like what you didn't do yet, So I think another thing I just want to point out is that it's been really interesting to see how this project became as much an exercise in exploration in how to represent these ideas as it was about what the actual forms would be. And I think the representation and really dealing with issues of scale and how do you make analogies between known things and new things is something that's been a great lesson for you. And I don't know, the model is a really interesting sort of late-breaking development in that. And so I think this question of how can architecture and urbanism really improve the social life of cities is something that is not a new question, and you're taking it up in a new kind of way, and infusing it with other ideas like how do you tie it into the natural environment and how do you foster innovation. So I think that your persistence has really served you well in this process, and so has your rigor and your curiosity and your good humor. And I think that, and your willingness to sort of try, just like, all right, I'll try that. Yeah. And what Matt said, I want to just reiterate that Thesis is really about tackling something big that's going to serve you throughout your career. So I don't think there's any danger that you're going to run out of fuel. Like all of these things are little nuggets of like intense energy potential. So congratulations. It's been great.